And welcome back to Echoes in Communities. Thank you so much for joining us again. We are so glad to see you. I'm Kim.
I am Moira Specter, still dead, and still far more polished and put together than you know who.
And we are your co-hosts for episode 1, The Black Dahlia. I am so glad that you guys are here. I am super excited to be actually getting this first episode out. I've been waiting so long. As I said in the introduction video, we are jumping into the time machine and heading back to 1947. To set the stage, it's January 1947 in Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles is a city of post-war promise, and it is full of sunlit deception. On the one hand, the soldiers are home, World War II is over, the Depression and Prohibition are in the rearview mirror. In Southern California, there are lots and lots of jobs, and the weather is almost always beautiful. There are beaches and great places to eat and a jumping nightlife, but underneath all of that glamour, though, it can be a little darker, a little more sinister. More money, power, politics, the arts, they have a huge impact on how LA operates and who gets what kind of recognition and when. And it's against this backdrop that a woman's body is found. She is young, she has been surgically mutilated, and she is posed as if she is in some sort of a performance piece. Her name was Elizabeth Short. The world came to know her as the Black Dahlia, and this is probably one of America's most infamous unsolved murders. This story has a little bit of everything. It has mystery, it has cover-ups and police corruption and gore and shady doctors. Her death was so disturbing in its time that even as police were giving interviews and tipping off the press, so many of those officers were bothered by what they saw, they didn't want to speak of it in great detail, even years later. Detective Harry Hansen was on the scene, and decades later he said, quote, "I've seen it all, but this one haunted me," end quote. The press, of course, is having an absolute field day. The reporters were, as they still do today. They're racing around each other, trying to develop an inside scoop, make up a nickname for the murderer and the murderer, and they're spinning their own theories about what had happened and who this lady was. What got buried and forgotten in all of this frenzy was Elizabeth Short herself. Who she was and what brought her to the city and what her dreams and aspirations were and what she and her murder said about the time and the place where it occurred. Those things are so important. Over the course of this episode, we're going to explore what we know about Elizabeth herself, the world and the city she lived in, and who might have killed her, and why her murder more than 75 years later still echoes through America's consciousness. The culture and society in Southern California in the 1940s was a far cry from what we imagine LA in 2025 to look like. To understand this case, you need to understand kind of what was going on in Los Angeles in the late 40s. California was reinventing itself at this point. Hollywood had always been all about show business for decades, but the surrounding city and the county were changing too. It was moving from a rural and agricultural economy and community to one of commerce and business and subdivisions and jobs and housing and just all of these things that were going on. The population was absolutely exploding. World War II had just ended 2 years ago. Many veterans and their young families had returned home either to California or were moving from other parts of the country. There was a thriving arts and literary scene, and Americans were feeling like they had a new lease on life. And LA felt for a lot of people like the place to chase those dreams and to put down some roots. There was a lot of shine, but underneath that shine, there was also a sense of falseness, kind of has always been a hint that some of the dreams that had maybe turned into nightmares and the need to keep secrets. And there was also show business and the media machines, and those were just built to devour the dreams of Elizabeth Short and so many young women just like her. There were plenty of young moms and new housewives and movie stars and established women that had arrived in LA seeking love or escape or fame, but some just found unemployment and predatory industries and predatory men. These women were marginalized in society and facing a pretty general and official indifference. 1947 was a time when the line between starlet and sex worker was still kind of thin. And, I think everybody has heard a reference to the casting couch, and that for many years seemed to be the expectation of the movie industry. Think about how long took to get from where they were to the hashtag Me Too movement, and how we've heard from actors in the past few years about the exploitation of both male and female actors in this business. In 1947, women who didn't make the cut for society, who weren't making all of the right decisions, were living a pretty dangerous life. The LAPD at this point had a reputation for being pretty deeply flawed. They were considered by many to be racist and sexist and concerned more with politics than image and justice. The press promoted the idea of, quote, loose women and, quote, girl hitchhikers, people of color, and juvenile delinquency as ruining America. So just like today, they needed a good story to keep the masses churned up and fearful of the unfamiliar and voting for their candidates and buying their newspapers. After Elizabeth's body was found, headlines screamed things like Black Dahlia slain, nude body found cut in two, and the front pages were splashed with morbid details and pictures. Very little media released expressed concern for the victim or her family. One columnist heard Payne said, "We've never seen anything like it." Her smile was haunting, and that name. The editor of one paper allegedly told his team, find the mother, get her a quiet crying quote from her, and run it by lunch. And they did that. They did exactly that. When one paper got in touch with Elizabeth's mother, they seriously told her that her daughter had won a beauty contest, and just to keep her on the line to keep talking so that they could release this information to her and get her crying. Pretty classy, right? So the Black Dahlia case kind of became a mirror for Los Angeles, and it reflected all of the sensationalism and misogyny and the brutal risks faced by women trying to survive in the shadow of Hollywood. Elizabeth Short's death was disturbing, but the way the public consumed it, I think that might have been even worse. I've heard something as I've been doing some research for some of these podcasts, and it really kind of stuck with me, primarily because it rings true to my ethics or values, I guess. It's part of the reason that I wanted to format these podcasts with an emphasis on the events and communities rather than on the grimy, gruesome details of the crimes or the criminals. So what I heard was that if you have a crime and a victim, you need to understand the victimology, because that will lead you to the truth of what happened and who committed the crime. The facts at a crime scene are just that. Somebody did something, it was horrible, this was the result. A person was injured or killed or robbed, and there's no turning back the clock on that. In many cases, the community, though, is also affected, and it changes the community at a sociological level. The community and the victim are so important that we don't need to give the criminal any more recognition. So I'm going to try and keep that to a minimum. They don't need any more infamy. So that being said, I want to talk a little bit about the victimology in the Black Dahlia case and what we know about who Elizabeth Short was. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29th, 1924 in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. Her parents were Cleo Alvin and Phoebe May, and she was the third of 5 daughters. So Cleo lost almost all of his savings, basically, in the 1929 stock market, and his car was then later found abandoned on the Charleston Bridge, and it was presumed at that time that he had jumped to his death in the Charles River. Elizabeth was just 6 years old at the time. So Phoebe, with 5 daughters to raise, began to work as a bookkeeper to support her family. Elizabeth herself was sick. She had frequent bouts of bronchitis and severe asthma attacks. And the treatment for this at the time was to do surgery, and she had that surgery at 15. And the doctors recommended she periodically relocate to a warmer climate. So her mom started sending her to spend winters when she was 15 in Miami. She did that, and she ended up quitting high school during her sophomore year. She never went back, and she was never able to complete that. So in 1942, Phoebe received a letter from the presumed dead Cleo, the girl's dad, her know where he was and that he was sorry and he started a new life in California. So Elizabeth, she's used to moving around. She packs up, and at 18, she moves to Vallejo, California to be with her dad. Now remember, she hadn't seen him since she was 6 years old. And unfortunately, this relationship did not rekindle the way I'm sure she hoped it would. She and her father argued constantly, and by mid-January of 1943, she'd moved out of the house. She got a job at Camp Cook near Lompoc, California, and it's there that she met an Army Air Force sergeant, and the two moved in together very briefly. He was reported to be abusive, and she ended up leaving for Santa Barbara in the summer of 1943. By September of that year, she had been arrested for underage drinking in a bar, and they packed her up and sent her back to her mother in Boston. She wasn't crazy about this, and it was not long before she was gone again, and she left Massachusetts for Florida. And according to one account of her time in Florida, she met another officer there and became engaged to Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr. He was reported to later die from an injury suffered in a plane crash in August of 1945. But we're going to come back to that a little bit. So in July of 1946, she goes back to Southern California. And in the 9 months before her death, she had been working as a waitress and renting a room behind a nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard. In the weeks before her death, Elizabeth had returned to Los Angeles from a short trip to San Diego. She'd gone with Robert Red Manley, and Manley was a boyfriend, a 25-year-old married salesman. And he would later report that he had dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA at her request because her sister was visiting. Some staff at the Biltmore did report that they recalled seeing her use a phone in the lobby of the hotel, and then she was later seen at the Crown Grill cocktail lounge about a half-mile from the Biltmore. One friend said that Elizabeth didn't really live dangerously. She was living on hope. Other friends said that she could be described as polite and charming and a dreamer, but really behind that facade, what you have is a really young woman, and she's running out of options. Some people described her as loose. In reality, She was just young. She was 22 at the time of her death. She had been living a fairly unsupervised and definitely transient lifestyle since she was 15 years old and she was in high school. And she made some poor choices along the way, but that is kind of the definition of the late teens and early 20s. In the end, she was broke and often jobless, sometimes homeless. Yeah, maybe she stretched the truth to impress sometimes, but not so much. So that brings us back to Major Gordon. You remember him from Florida? She told men that she had been engaged, but that wasn't really maybe the truth. There's no real documentation of that or anybody that says that happened. She also told him she'd traveled the world and some things like that. So she was just trying to be more grown up than she was. And where she stayed and what she did between January the 9th and the morning of January the 15th, when her body was found, it's really unknown. We don't have any sources to tell us what was going on. What we do know is she was just a kid. She was 22 at the time of her death. And though she was living on the edges and doing some wild and crazy things, especially for the time, there was nothing in her behavior, nothing how she spent her time, and nothing that she did that ever made her death acceptable. So let's look at the crime and where Elizabeth's body was discovered. So first off, it was discovered by a mom in a neighborhood fairly early in the morning. She was taking her child for a walk. It was called Lemert Park neighborhood. It had been around since the 1920s, but was really being built up post-war. They're building lots of single-family homes, and that's why you have the combination of the houses being in the neighborhood as well as the vacant lots. Her body was discovered, and she was gruesomely mutilated. She was mutilated using a surgical technique, though. It was one taught in the medical schools during the 1930s called a hemicorporectomy. She was bisected at the waist, entirely drained of blood, and that left her skin very ghostly pale. And medical examiners were able to later identify that technique and that she'd been dead for approximately 10 hours, placing her time of death sometime during the very late evening of January 14th to the very early morning of January 15th. Evidence suggested that the killer had washed her and otherwise cleansed her body to get rid of evidence. She had horrific injuries. Her face had been slashed from the corners of her mouth to her ears, and it was extended into what's known as a Glasgow smile. Additionally, there were lacerations found on her thighs and on her breasts, and some pretty large sections of flesh that were deliberately removed. The lower half of her body had been, again, bisected, carefully placed about a foot away from her upper body, and her internal organs had been repositioned outside the body. Her body had been posed, arms raised above her head, with her elbows bent at right angles, and her legs spread apart to the lower body. And this was a deliberate sexual display. Near the remains, the detectives discovered a heel print in the soil, amid the tire tracks, and a cement sack containing diluted blood. Now, these were later trampled by all of the people going through. And though her identity was initially unknown, she was later identified by her fingerprints submitted to the FBI because they were on file from that arrest back in 1943. So somewhere, somehow, this killer had the time and the privacy to complete this horrendous act and then basically move very little evidence to the scene. This is definitely serial killer, psychosexual homicide stuff. But in 1947, they weren't real familiar with that. Unfortunately, we are today, and we know what we're looking at. And this case remains unsolved. There's not really a perpetrator identified. More than 60 people confessed to this crime. Most were attention seekers, but some really seem to know more details than they should have. On January 21st, an individual claiming responsibility for the murder of Elizabeth Short contacted the Los Angeles Examiner and spoke with editor James Richardson. And the caller commented that the newspaper's coverage and his stated intention was to eventually surrender himself to authorities. However, he indicated that he wanted to give the police a little more time to figure it out, I guess. He further noted that the newspaper should expect some souvenirs later in the mail. On January 24th, a manila envelope was delivered to the Los Angeles Examiner, and it did feature a message on the exterior composed of clipped out newspaper print that said, "Here's Dahlia's belongings." The contents included Elizabeth's birth certificate, her personal photographs, business cards, slips of paper with names written on them, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen, also embossed on the cover. The packet had been meticulously wiped down with gasoline, and that's a detail that was consistent with the condition of Elizabeth's body as well. And that led investigators to believe it was really a good chance this was sent by the perpetrator. Partial fingerprints were also recovered, and they were forwarded to the FBI. However, during transportation, the fingerprints were compromised and they could never be analyzed. The same day, a handbag and a black suede shoe were discovered atop of a garbage can or garbage receptacle in an alley approximately 2 miles from the primary crime scene near Norton Avenue. And both items had been similarly cleaned with gasoline, and they had eliminated any viable forensic evidence that was available at the time. And then on March 14th, a beach caretaker in Venice located a pile of men's clothing that was near the shoreline at the foot of Breeze Avenue, I guess. And a handwritten note in pencil was found within a shoe. And this is what the note stated: "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but I have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this is the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that or this. Sorry, Mary." The clothing included a herringbone tweed coat and trousers, a brown and white t-shirt, tan socks, white undergarments, and size 8 tan sort of moccasin-style shoes. There was no identifying information or markings that were present with this clothing. Subsequently, Mark Hansen, the guy that was on the name of the address book, was identified as a person of interest. And he did know Elizabeth Short. He was a wealthy Los Angeles nightclub and theater owner, and he was an acquaintance. He had previously allowed Elizabeth to reside at his residence with mutual friends, and according to some of the friends, particularly Ann Toff, who had also been her roommate previously, Hansen had recently made some pretty unwanted sexual advances towards the victim, and when these were rejected, Toff felt like this was a potential motive for the murder. Hansen also verified that the purse and the shoe and the alley did belong to Short, so he recognized her items. Despite this, he was ultimately cleared as a suspect.
Oh, my turn. Really? So glad you know how to share the stage, Kim. The LAPD interviewed over 150 individuals in the weeks following the murder, including Robert Manley, one of the last known persons to have seen Short alive. He passed multiple polygraph examinations and was excluded as a suspect. Police also interviewed several contacts from Hansen's address book. One was Martin Lewis, who had an alibi for time of the crime, providing evidence that he was in Portland visiting a dying relative. At its peak, the investigation included 750 police personnel, including 400 deputies from the LA County Sheriff's Department and 250 California Highway patrolmen. Searches were extensive and included the storm drains, abandoned buildings, and various segments of the Los Angeles River, but yielded no additional evidence.
In an effort to encourage public assistance, City Councilman Lloyd G. Davis actually offered a $10,000 reward that's equivalent to almost $141,000 in 2025 for any information leading to arrest and conviction of the perpetrator. And this announcement resulted in more confessions, but some of these individuals were actually subsequently charged with obstruction of justice because of this as well. A number of individuals continue to be considered either a person of interest by researchers or authors or independent investigators. These include Dr. Walter Bailey, who was a physician and was suggested by the former Los Angeles Times copy editor, Larry Harnish, Times publisher Norman Chandler, who got Elizabeth pregnant, Leslie Dillon, Joseph DeMatteis, Artie Lane, Mark Hansen, Dr. Francis Sweeney, Woody Guthrie, who was a musician at the time, Bugsy Siegel, Orson Welles, Dr. George Hodel, who we'll come back to, Fred Sexton, George Knowlton, Dr. Patrick S. O'Reilly, and Jack Anderson. So probably the biggest name in this is Dr. George Hodel. And he was a wealthy physician with kind of a dark past. His son, Steve Hodel, who later became a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department, accused him in a best-selling book of being the murderer. Dr. George Hodel was born October 10th, 1907, and died May 16th, 1999. His parents were Russian Jewish immigrants, and they moved to the Los Angeles area. George was considered to be a prodigy. He was reported to have an IQ over 180, and when it got time for college, he first attended Caltech and then transferred over to UC Berkeley, where he got his undergrad degree and went on to go to med school and graduate from San Francisco Medical School. By the 1930s and 40s, though, he was practicing in Los Angeles, and his focus was on venereal diseases, also with a background in surgery. So this drew some suspicion. Basically, the bisection and the level of precision and the surgical technique. He had also been a medical school instructor, so he would have known this procedure. He was relatively close to the area, and he was known to hold some gatherings that were considered surreal and that had some definite undertones of sadomasochism. Further suspicion arose in the 1950s. The LAPD actually put a bug into his home, and Hodel was heard making the following comments. And he said, quote, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it. Now, they can't talk to my secretary because she's dead," end quote. So his secretary in question actually had died under mysterious circumstances as well. Investigators were never able to pursue any charges because they could never identify enough evidence or a particular suspect. Later on, he ended up fleeing the country to the Philippines. He was brought up on charges molesting his 14-year-old daughter, and he fled the country. Character psychological profile was considered to be narcissistic, controlling, and with characteristics consistent with psychopathy. So obviously, no charges, so no trial. But something else did happen in Los Angeles and in the community, in part as a direct result of this case. In 1949, a grand jury was convened in Los Angeles to investigate widespread corruption within the LAPD. And at the time, the department had a national reputation already for misconduct, with issues deeply rooted in politics and in organized crime. Key concerns of the community included officers accepting bribes from gamblers and brothel owners and bootleggers in exchange for either protection or advance warning of raids or some other consideration. The LAPD had known associations with mobster Mickey Cohen, with some officers reported to actually have been on his payroll. Evidence tampering was also a recurring problem. And, that's kind of later echoed in the OJ case where we heard at least accusations of that. The Black Dahlia investigation in particular, multiple officers were accused of leaking evidence and photos to the press, either for money or for favorable media coverage. The department maintained extremely close ties with both the Los Angeles Examiner and the Los Angeles Times, and that was felt to be a corrupting influence. So these selective leaks were used to manipulate public perception, suppress criticism, and then there was abuse of power issues as well, particularly against marginalized women and women of color. And the tipping point was the 1948 Potter Report, which exposed systemic graft and mismanagement. The grand jury ultimately confirmed pretty widespread incompetence, corruption, and inappropriate relationships with organized crime as well as the newspapers, and it decided deliberate crime scene leaks in the Black Dahlia case and highlighted the department's culture of silence and failure to prosecute internal offenses as one of the things contributing to the fact that this case was never solved. LAPD was known for rarely disciplining its officers, and complaints, when they did get filed, disappeared. The department suffered from inadequate training and oversight, as well as accountability. The 1949 grand jury criticized low professional standards, lack of supervision, and a culture that protected officers rather than correcting misconduct. Elizabeth's murder became sort of a flashpoint. The case gained infamy, not only because of its brutality, but because the police had so blatantly leaked information. When suspects emerged but were never charged, when information was lost, when evidence was lost, it sort of kind of confirmed to the community there was widespread corruption. And this failure, it should have been a turning point for LA and the department. Instead, it kind of persisted, and you saw it resurface again. 1965 Watts riots, 1991 with the King beating, and beyond. So these weren't new things. These things had been festering for decades and just sort of flaring up. So finally, the grand jury identified potential interference as a major barrier to reform, and that included interference by politicians, city council, and the higher-ups and the officers, shielding lower officers or lower-ranking officers from any serious effort to hold them or the department accountable. And the consequences, those continue to echo across generations. We've seen the cases on the news. Reforms were proposed in 1949. The grand jury recommended sweeping reforms. So they recommended, first, the establishment of civilian review boards. Second, the stricter internal affairs oversight. And third, independent audits of the LAPD. Police Chief Clements E. Horrell, who had led the department during the Black Dahlia investigation, was forced to resign. The grand jury found him to be complicit in just this widespread corruption, as well as in a lot of the other things that were going on. His successor, William H. Parker, came to office in 1950, and he ushered in what was known to be the professional era of the LAPD, and he did introduce a lot of administrative changes, and he emphasized discipline, but many of the systemic issues just persisted. In spite of a leadership change, the department continued to just sort of struggle with ideas like bigotry and sexism, racial profiling, police brutality. The culture of secrecy remained, and that allowed the wound to just keep festering and oozing and coming back and coming back. So looking back now, it's really striking how much was leaked to the press. That wouldn't happen as much today, but then again, today everybody has a camera. They would not probably be allowed into the scene where they were actually trampling on the scene and destroying evidence, as were the detectives at the time. Elizabeth Short's murder became a symbol of institutional failure and kind of those dark undercurrents of post-war LA. Among all the bright and shiny, there was this really bad stuff going on. And Elizabeth Short should never be remembered solely as the victim of a horrific crime. She shouldn't just be a cautionary tale for young women, and she shouldn't just be an unsolved mystery. Her life and her death reflect something that's far deeper. And if that's how American culture and American communities have historically treated and viewed women, especially poor women and women that are basically on the margins of society, those women who don't fit neatly into the acceptable mold of suburban housewife or professional or whatever the case may be. Her murder exposed a national blind spot in our culture. It revealed how society, sometimes unconsciously, devalues women who don't fit into their little box. Um, and that includes people in, experiencing poverty, addiction, homelessness, an unacceptable profession, and they're treated as less than, as if their lives don't matter. And when we talk about this, it's also important to realize this was more than 75 years ago. And though her case was horrendous, it's easier to kind of put it into perspective in seeing that women had just gotten the right to vote in our country about 20 years before this happened. So many of the people in power at the time, whether it was officers, politicians, leaders, they were mostly men, and they just couldn't imagine what would bring a woman to this case or into this scene. They couldn't visualize their daughters as Elizabeth. She had slipped into that category that made it socially permissible to kind of look the other way and to objectify her in her life, in making up stories, and to sensationalize her in death. There wasn't really a place where women had secured meaning to their lives as individuals, and they weren't recognized as full members of the societies by institutions or by the public. Um, so while 1940s LA was exploding and exciting and it was growing, it was also full of transient populations and hidden alleyways and dark corners and places where those that were living in those margins could easily be exploited and just as easily forgotten. Elizabeth's death became the Black Dahlia. It was a myth and a headline and a commodity. Her image continued to appear in pulp magazines, in horror comics, in films, songs, and in crime shows. For decades, she was reduced to a symbol. Her humanity was erased. And even now, as we sit here and we're analyzing her case, you really have to ask yourself, I have to ask myself, are we just continuing this pattern, or is there something to be gained from retelling and relooking at this more than just curiosity? The Black Dahlia case also marked a turning point in American um, crime slash media slash crime reporting, and that's where it really blurred the lines between journalism and entertainment in both a visual and a written aspect. This is the onset of the celebrity victim, where who you are makes you relevant, or what happened makes you relevant, or who gets justice and who is considered worthy of justice. This was all sort of meshing and becoming at this time. So Elizabeth became folklore. She became a whispered story, a glamorized image, a noir tragedy. But the center of all of this, she was just a 22-year-old woman She had her whole life ahead of her, and that life was stolen, and her story was hijacked the moment her face appeared on that front page. So what really changed? Did anything? There have been some police reforms. Um, did we simply gawk and grieve and move on? To a degree, we did. We love the sensational one, and media loves to sell it to us. But she was more than the manner of her death, and her justice never came. And I think that's one of the places I look and I say, okay, this city is still haunted by silence. Our community and our culture are haunted by speculation. And her case is an example. But how do we as individuals take the cruelty out of that so we don't forget the real person behind that myth?
So the next time you're walking through Los Angeles, or anywhere, take a moment to look around. Notice the people you pass. Whether you're on a quiet side street in your hometown, or strolling down Hollywood Boulevard, where the stars are set in stone, remember, those sidewalks aren't the only places where ghosts linger. Every person you pass has a story. Some you may never know, some you might never want to, but each one is human. They deserve your attention, your awareness, simply because they exist alongside you in this world.
So, this is the first episode. I thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for staying through to the end. If you like what you heard, please come back. We'll have another episode releasing on the 8th, which is Sunday. But for sure, if you can, go down below, hit a like, hit a share, give a comment. You can just say, hi, Kim, how's it going? Hi, Moira, how's it going? And we can just go from there. But it helps so much in making sure that the algorithm sees that the episodes are there and gets them out to other people that might enjoy them. So in 4 days, we will see you for another episode, and we're going to be heading down south for that one. Thank you again, and